All right. So we were working on the 5 ranks the past 3 times. And as a reminder, those were written by Dongshan, who lived in China in around the 800s and what is often referred to as the Golden Age of Zen. And what they really are is 5 poems about enlightenment and about sort of what are the different stages of enlightenment, what does that mean? When you're looking at someone and you sort of look at how they respond, as a teacher, and you're looking at a student, you can sort of sense based on this where they might be and what they might need to work on. If we're going to be teaching about revealing your enlightened nature, right? Because there's nothing to give, there's nothing to attain. I'm not giving you enlightenment, you're already enlightened, but you still reveal it through your practice. And so that revealing has steps. And in Dongshan's estimation, there are 5. And we have arrived at step 4, or rank 4, which is called arrival at mutual integration. And so we're going to talk about what mutual integration means and how probably all of you are, at least the folks in this room right now, are already doing it to some degree, but also how we might refine it. So the poem goes like this. When 2 blades cross points, there's no need to withdraw. So when 2 blades cross points, there's no need to withdraw. The master swordsman is like the lotus blossoming or blooming in fire. Such a person has, in and of themselves, a heaven-soaring spirit. So when 2 blades cross points, there's no need to withdraw. The master swordsman is like a lotus blooming in fire. Such a person has in and of themselves a heaven-soaring spirit. So I don't know if any of y'all have ever done any sword fighting. Nice. My daughter's just taken a few fencing classes. I actually have done a lot of sword fighting, mostly in college. But if you're sword fighting and you're sword fighting with someone who also knows how to sword fight, you don't actually move that much because you're looking for what is, you can sort of see as you start to do something, they start to respond, and you can tell, oh, okay, they already know what I'm going to do. There's no point in doing it, right? There's no point in doing a big flourish. It's funny, if you watch Star Wars, right? All of the lightsabers are going everywhere. And the more masterful the Jedi is, the more of this there is. But, if you actually go and study with someone who's done sword fighting for 30, 40, 50 years, and then it's whoop-ah! And that's it, right? And I mean, I'm not that good, but I have had the good fortune on a couple of occasions to spend time with people who were. So when 2 blades cross points, there's no need to withdraw, right? So what are the 2 blades, right? Well, the 2 blades are the blade of form and the blade of emptiness, right? They're the blade of the physical world that we inhabit in all of the forms and the absolute oneness, ultimate reality, big mind. And so it's really critical and brilliant way to say it, right? When ultimate reality and regular reality collide, because they're not actually separate, there's no need to withdraw, right? We don't need to fall into, oh, well, I'm just going to stay and, I've discovered this inner state of peace and I'm just going to live there and withdraw from the world, right? And there's no need to say, well, that enlightenment's all well and good, but down here at the docks, we got to deal with the real world, right? Withdraw from awakening, It's too painful to be awake, right? And when I'm awake, I see the way that people create their own suffering. But when I try to explain to them why that is, if I do that, they might not listen. And that hurts my heart. Trungpa Rinpoche says that if you practice and you open your heart, that it feels like that if a mosquito were to land upon it, you would die. And I found that to be the case, right? That when we walk through the world with a heart open and we look at others with the eyes of compassion, it's painful because grief arises, because we see all of the suffering that there is optional and non-optional suffering. And so if you walk through the woods and a tree falls on you and breaks your leg, that's not optional, right? But people create a lot of their own suffering in their relationships and their life choices. I mean, I happen to do a lot of work in the recovery space, right? So that's, in some ways, addiction's complicated and a disease, so it's not quite fair to say that's creating your own suffering, but to some degree it is, right? You're certainly participating in the creation of your own suffering. But there's no need to withdraw from that. We can allow ourselves to experience what we experience, including the pain that arises when we witness things that are hard to witness or hard to bear. And so part of sort of bringing enlightenment out into the world, right, this thing that we carry within, is that when we bring it forth, we also then have to, or are allowed to, or have the opportunity to be with what that brings up, which is heightening of all of the feelings. Right? So there can be great joy at a simple pleasure, a sunset or a baby's coo, and there can be tremendous sadness at watching someone stumble over the same issue they struggled with for so long, or with looking at the course that's happening in the world where we don't agree. A lot of folks bring that up, and Dongshan actually lived around a time of persecution of Buddhism, where Buddhist monasteries had accrued a lot of wealth, and there was sort of a revolution, and a lot of the wealth was seized, and monks were forced to return to daily life. And if you imagine, if you have a monk class, they may not easily be able to, after 20 years of living in a monastery, just go get a job. Like, what job? And so those sorts of challenges in the world have always been there, and facing them with an open heart is painful, but it also allows for a compassionate response to emerge in the moment. So the master swordsman is like the lotus blooming in fire, right? Where else would we express awakening? Right? So the lotus is a flower. It blooms. Typically the lotus is discussed as blooming in the mud, because that's what they do. They bloom in a swamp. And so the metaphor is beautiful flower growing out of the disgusting, muddy swamp water. So that's a great analogy for an awakened person in the world, right? That even in the world of difficulties and problems and death and taxes, this Dharma emerges, enlightenment emerges, the Buddha appears, our Buddha nature reveals itself. But that's not what this says. It says blooming in fire. Well, if you set a lotus on fire, it's like every other flower, it burns. Right? So how is that, what are we talking about? Well, we bloom in the fire. I'm fond of saying, the work that I do essentially involves advocacy and creating and ensuring programming for people who struggle with addiction. And to some extent, there's a political aspect to that work. And I encounter people from all political parties. And I'm very fond of saying, my objective is to advocate for people who struggle with addiction. And so I don't care what your political party is, right? What I care about is, do you care about helping people who struggle with this disease? If so, let's talk, right? Bloom in the fire. There doesn't have to be a conflict. And in fact, adversity very often is what brings out the best in us. It's where we discover who we are. Such a person has in and of themselves a heaven-soaring spirit. So when we come from the absolute, when we come from an awareness of Buddha nature, then I am not fixed and you are not fixed, right? It's all one. And because it's not fixed, it is pure. Right? How can it have a negative characteristic if it's not fixed? And that's really important, because it's the first step in not assigning you a position. Last time we talked about non-attachment, right? So if you present yourself to me and I make a bunch of assumptions about who you are, even like well-considered ones, even ones based on your past behavior, right? Now you aren't there anymore, right? Now what I'm seeing is the version of you that I have in my mind, which gives you no opportunity to change. And my experience over years is that if you engage with someone and your image is already decided, they don't open up and engage with you. They do the thing that you expect. And so now the lotus is not blooming. Now there's just fire, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. Now, it may be that I'm open and not attached and warm and compassionate and supportive and helpful, and the other person is toxic and difficult and hostile and doesn't take the opportunity to be anything other than that. And that's okay because of dependent co-arising, right? Because who they are and what they're expressing is based on beginningless karma, right? It's based on beginningless conditions. And also maybe I'm wrong, right? So there's two pieces to consider. One is what we see in others is based on their history and their parents' history and their parents' parents' history and all the way back to the Big Bang with like unlimited interconnected conditions that cause what appears in the moment to appear. And how do we know my assessment is right? Am I going to walk around being like, well, as a trained therapist and Zen teacher, I have assessed that you are behaving in a bad way, right? Well, what is that? That's just another landmine, right? In our particular branch of this lineage, the last book of koans that we study is called the Book of Equanimity. And I love that one is positioned right before you become a teacher, because a big chunk of that is essentially, here are all the landmines you can step on once you think you really understand this stuff. And that's one of them, right? Is trusting my assessment. Not knowing is most intimate. I can have my perceptions, but I can also put space around them that they might be wrong, right? Now I'm liberating myself and others, right? The Buddha says upon awakening, so the story goes, I and all beings are simultaneously awakened, right? I and all beings are simultaneously enlightened. What does that mean? Why is that the moment? Because the Buddha and all beings are connected? Is it because, once the Buddha is enlightened, he's able to perceive the enlightenment in everyone else? It's because that is the original state, right? They didn't all become enlightened because the Buddha woke up. All beings are enlightened, and the Buddha realized it. If we take that seriously, then it completely changes how we orient toward others. If you continue to study this path, you'll study the Buddha's precepts. And the precepts are essentially a set of ethical teachings. And, they start with really simply, cease from evil, practice good for others. And you could kind of just stop there if you wanted to. There's other ones which I think are useful, but how do we do that, right? How do we cease from evil? How do we practice good? How do we practice good from others? Well, a great starting point is reconciling this meeting place between the relative and the absolute as just an expression of what does this moment ask? And can I do it? Instead of being stuck in my old patterns. Or perhaps bring forth one of my old patterns. Maybe that's the best thing. I don't know. Depends on what's happening. Right? That's why we can't talk about it. Because I can't tell you what to do because I'm not you. And whatever you do, the most appropriate, most skillful action is going to emerge in context. So we meet our life head on with all of the things, right? All of the content, all of our baggage, all of our perceptions of ourselves, all of everyone else's perceptions, the whole island of misfit toys, the whole disaster. you know, the waterfalls in Patagonia and, Auschwitz. Like the whole thing. It's all one. It's all part of it. And so how could I possibly sitting here, up on the high seat, tell you how to respond to all of that? Right? Instead, what this recommends, what Dongshan is saying with the fourth rank, is just meet it and don't withdraw. Right? Just don't withdraw. There's a teacher I know in Colorado named Gyoto Sensei, and he gave a Dharma talk recently that I listened to. And he's talking about the song "The Hotel California," and he said you can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. Right, and that's right in line with what we're talking about right now. Right, that I can check out. I got a lot of ways to check out. Video games, cell phones, substances, relationships, food. Overwork, like my opinions, intellectual pursuits. I mean, there's so many, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with most of those things, right? Like, it's okay to do intellectual things. It's okay to have relationships. It's okay, like we're not judging any of the things, but I could use them as a vehicle to check out, right? But even if I check out, I haven't left. Right? I'm still in the world. Life is still going on. I'm building karma toward. And karma is just cause and effect, right? So I'm creating causes, and the downstream effects will probably be unhelpful if I'm doing things in a way that checks me out. And so I want to check in, right? I want to not withdraw, right? Because the sword is the sword of enlightenment, and I hold the sword and then see, right? Maybe it goes back in the sheath. Maybe it strikes. Maybe it just, I don't know. And so that's the thing I really like about the Dharma, which is kind of a ridiculous thing for a Zen teacher to say, like, oh, I like the Dharma. It's great. You should try it. No, one of the things I really like about it is that it leaves it to you to discover and express. Right? It doesn't give you a formula. It doesn't say, well, just be this type of person and then it'll work. It's like, I don't know. Like when you are the lotus blooming in fire, right, which you are, I'm fond of saying that, I'm in the business of training, the world is, in some ways you could say the world is on fire and I'm in the training of firefighters business, right? But so when you're doing that, when you're blooming in fire, right, and you're not withdrawing, you're going to have all of the human experiences. You're going to have all of the joy and all of the pain. And there's a funny misnomer, right? Because people will say to me, like, even people who have little interest in Zen, but know what I do, will say like, oh, you should, when you go visit that group of people, you should do a mindfulness thing, help them chill out. And I don't disagree, right? That my life is more peaceful with practice in it. That's why I keep doing it, or one of the reasons. But the purpose of this practice is not to relax, right? Acceptance of what is lowers resistance, and anxiety to a high degree, unless there's actually something happening that's scary. Background anxiety is often resistance to what is. So if what is accepted, anxiety reduces. That's true. But the purpose of this practice is to work directly with what is, right? And not withdraw. So what is that? Well, when I feel anxious, I don't go, okay, I will go to my Zen place and I will avoid the anxiety will pass because I am a Zen teacher. No. When I feel anxious, I go, hello, anxiety, what are you all about? And if it's at a 5, I try to turn it up to a 10, right? Like I want to feel like what I want to go there and feel the fullness of it and discover its nature and then allow it to pass. Now, it's okay also to say, whoa, that was a lot. I might need to sit more to process that. I might need to go to my therapist. I mean, like, I'm not, don't become a masochist. All of these things have to exist in some kind of middle way balance, right? So I'm not working with a feeling to the point of harming myself. But generally, Don't withdraw. Stay there. Stay on the cushion. Stay with it. See what comes. Really understand it. Because no one's going to understand you better than you, right? This is the purpose of this path is to study the self. And so, the last thing I'll say is that, this is the place where wisdom comes from, right? Is when we stay with what is and then we allow our response to emerge naturally. The light's always shining. And a lot of what this stage is about is that being the case, you can use it to benefit others. And what is that benefit, right? Sometimes you're of great benefit. Sometimes you're of little benefit. Who knows? It's very challenging. The middle way isn't splitting the difference. It's a separate path. But it's worth it. Okay.